we are talking about looking back on the 2021 predictions that I made in January. So this is a test to see how well those predictions came about as we're now almost at the end of the year. So some of you may have been on that webinar live, or you may have listened to it on record either via our website or via our YouTube channel. So today is very much about that reflection, and I'd really be interested in what your views are in terms of the last year and what you feel has had the biggest impact on you from a data protection perspective. So for those of you that don't know who I am, that might be new to the webinar, my name is Kellie Peters. I'm a co-founder of Databasix, and I get super excited about data protection and data in general, to be perfectly honest. And I'm hoping that will come across today. Now, some of you who registered kindly shared with me what you for your predictions, or what you, based on your predictions, what you felt had actually came about this year. So when I talked at the beginning of the year, I talked about uncertainty with EU-UK data processing. Some of you said in January that you felt there'd be a higher volume of hacks. Some were concerned about the focus on cookie tracking. There was also the concern about working remotely, greater use of technology, therefore an increased attention to security. So when you registered today, some of you, or this week, some of you said that actually the focus for you this year has been consolidating recovery and building business. Some of you expressed that actually it's about keeping up to date with the changes in EU and UK data protection legislation, and making sure that where you do have European partners or European organisations, that they don't exclude you from sharing data with you. Cybersecurity continued to be a really big factor this year for many of you. And whereas at the beginning of the year, we were really talking about working remotely, now it's really about managing the employee return to the office and managing all the new policies that have come about because of the UK leaving the European Union. So before I go any further, are there any other reflections that you have before I talk about mine that you might want to share in the chat box in terms of what's your biggest reflection this year in terms of data protection? And if anyone is typing, that'll be fine. I'll come back to that in a moment. But I did also want to talk about the volume of subject access requests, which I have certainly seen a significant increase with clients this year. So if there are no additional reflections, let's really dig into what my views are. So one of the things I talked about at the beginning of the year was post-Brexit. And I stated at the time I didn't think much was going to change in terms of the day-to-day data protection activities. We still have to make sure that we are compliant with data protection. We still have to make sure that we can demonstrate our accountability, whether that be reviewing new systems to make sure that we've considered the risk, whether we are updating websites and including tracking on it to make sure we're compliant, or if it's just simply a matter of ensuring that we refresh staff training and introduce new members of staff to our way of working when it comes to data protection. Now, we still have data protection laws in this country. They haven't disappeared just because we've left the European Union. So we do have the UK GDPR and the Data Protection Act of 2018. Now, some of you who might be very keen on data protection might be aware that next year there is the potential for data protection legislation in this country to change because we now have, or we, the government, have greater control over our legislation. So the UK GDPR may slightly start to veer away from the look and the feel of what it is at the moment. Now, interestingly, I talked about EU representation, and this really will affect anybody that has European customers, doesn't have a European base, and actually the determination is that you do need a European representative. Most of you probably fall outside of that category, but on the side of caution, I wanted to make the point that in, I think it was June this year, the Dutch Data Protection Authority actually gave a financial penalty to a Canadian-based company um, for not having a EU representative. So a firm called locatefamily.com is a platform that allows users to search for contact details for people they have lost track of. And the Dutch Data Protection Authority's attention was drawn to the fact that the company had a series of complaints from individuals from within the Netherlands who felt that they were not compliant with with EU GDPR. Now, the fine that they were issued was €525,000, and they were given 12 weeks to remedy the situation. And if it wasn't remedied, they would then incur an additional 120,000 penalty in euros. So what I would say for anybody on this call is if you do have a European reach, you do have European customers accessing your platforms, you might want to undertake the assessment to determine whether or not you need an EU representative. If anyone's interested in that, I can send you the necessary links on the ICO website. And what continues to be the case is that we are no longer part of the European Data Protection Board because we're no longer part of Europe. So my question to everybody here, have you felt, apart from business challenges with Brexit, are you all of the opinion that actually your day-to-day data protection activities haven't changed since January? A yes or a no would be great in the chat box. Good. I'm glad to see that actually things have remained the same. I think that's a very good point that's been made. As long as we continue to work with our partners, actually, and we continue to work within the guidelines of the GDPR, it should continue to be easy, or easier, should I say. Now, what's really interesting is that I talked about at the beginning of the year about this uncertainty as to whether or not Europe was actually going to give us an adequacy decision, which would mean that the flow of data from Europe to the UK could continue. The UK was very clear at the beginning of January that data going from the UK to Europe would continue to flow freely because the Information Commissioner recognised the EU as a safe pair of hands to share data with. What we were looking for was a reciprocal decision from the EU. Now, after a lot of discussion, and it was very much to the wire, the UK adequacy decision was actually passed. Now, what I would say is that this is something that we all do need to keep in mind and keep an eye out for, because any decisions that we make, maybe in the case of changing data protection legislation in this country, if it is felt to be too fundamentally different from what the Europeans see as being safe or adequate, they have the right to be able to revoke that adequacy decision. Now, with the UK adequacy decision came the agreement that there needed to be, outside of data flows outside of Europe, we would have to adopt the new standard contract clauses that were being issued. Now, the EU actually went into quite a lot of detail, and they issued 4 different types of contracts that you could have to facilitate the transfer of data outside of Europe to, say, for example, the United States. And at the time, the UK was still going to be reliant on the European clauses. Now, because we have the UK data protection law, and we now have an adequacy decision. The UK Commissioner has actually issued her draft standard contract clauses. So what you need to be mindful of here is that if you have European customers, they shouldn't have to issue you with any standard contract clauses from data from the Europe to you as the UK, because it's allowed to freely flow. If you, as a UK company, you are transferring data outside of the UK, as soon as the UK standard contract clauses are approved, you will have to use those clauses to transfer data to non-EU countries. Now, the ICO does have a very good page on this in terms of what contracts you need to rely on. But I would recommend that you just know your data flows, which we've said time and time again on our webinars. Know your data flows. Know if it's you as the data controller in the UK transferring data to a processor or a controller outside of Europe, that you will need to be thinking about adopting the UK standard contract clauses rather than using the existing European ones. Which actually leads me really nicely onto international data transfers, because what has happened was the Information Commissioner has now issued her guidance on international data transfers. Now, what she calls this is a data transfer risk assessment. And I would urge you all to consider completing this for any data transfers where the country that you're transferring data to is not covered by an adequacy decision. So this would be places like, for example, the United States. And what this data transfer risk assessment tool is asking you to do is to understand the level of risk that you are allowing to take place when that data is transferred to a non-adequate country. Now, what you need to be thinking about is, for example, in America, the United States government does and can have access to American-based companies' data. And what we want the reassurance of is that any data that relates to UK residents is not part of that grab and access to the data. So the risk assessment tool that has been issued by the Commissioner is quite nice. It has quite a lot of flowcharts in it, allows you to complete that risk assessment. So don't blindly adopt a system that happens to be based in the US because it is easy to use, it's free of charge. You must conduct this risk assessment. And we have done a webinar on this as well, if you're interested in that, but definitely consider any international data transfers. But I'm sure that everybody that's on this webinar has already done all your data mapping, and this is something that you're well and truly on top of. Now, because I'm a bit of a data nerd and a bit of a geek when it comes to all things data protection, one of the things I raised at the beginning of the year is actually not only has the European Union and the UK really increased the types of legislation we have for data protection, other countries are also now doing this. So what you need to be thinking of as your company is not only do you need to consider the UK data protection legislation in this country, but if you are working with other countries like China or Brazil, Singapore, Australia or Canada, that you need to understand the data protection legislation that they have and whether or not there are elements of that where you need to evidence compliance with how you process personal data on their residents. So in China, the new personal information protection law came into force this month. So if you do have customers in China and you are processing their personal data, do take a look at the legislation and understand what are your responsibilities. Again, whilst the Brazilian data protection legislation actually came into force 2 years ago, it actually came in terms of financial penalties, really started to come into effect from August of this year. Now, Singapore has a Personal Data Protection Act, which did come into force on the 1st of February this year. And again, it's one of those where it asks you to be able to demonstrate your accountability when it comes to data protection. So please make sure that you, if you know where your data is being transferred to, you know where your clients and your customers are, really do understand what is, if there is anything at all, a data protection legislation in that country. Now, the other two that I've got listed here, which I had at the beginning of the year, is the fact that both Canada and Australia haven't yet amended or approved their updates. They are in the works, they are coming. Australia is already seen as an adequate country for us to transfer data to, as is Canada for personal data. However, we do need to keep an eye on whatever their changes are when it comes to these improvements. Bearing in mind that our concept of privacy by design and by default actually originated from Canada. So it's definitely one to watch. And most of these countries are adopting similar types of approaches to the GDPR. So greater responsibility on breach notification, greater awareness of the individual and their rights that they can ask you to demonstrate your compliance. Now, I did say that I thought there would be greater data protection breaches in 2021. And sadly, that has been very true. So in June of this year, Verizon did a data breach report. And what they showed was that there was a 33% increase in the number of confirmed breaches in 2021 compared to 2020. That's quite a lot. 10% of these breaches are classified as ransomware. Now, what I would say is that there are a lot more ransomware attacks going on at this moment in time. They are hitting the press on a very regular basis, and it doesn't matter what size of business you are. So some of you may have seen in the news over the summer, there was a school in Kent that was affected. There have been massive ransomware attacks in the US that have attacked both government, but also farming production. They've also attacked webcams and security cameras in this country. So we do need to be mindful about how we can protect ourselves against a ransomware attack, because these are going to continue into 2022. Interestingly, there's an increase in breaches that are using social engineering. So this is where individuals are trying to engage with you and really try and make you feel pressured to make a mistake. So some of the social engineering attacks that are happening are, you'll get a phone call, someone at the end of that phone call will come across as being really panicked, and they will try and make you feel panicked and then make a really rash decision. So it is being mindful that this is going to continue to happen. And how are you going to train your staff to be aware that this is something that it's not just a computer hack anymore? It's not just a phishing scam. People could genuinely be trying to threaten you via social engineering. Most attacks are do involve some kind of human error. I had a conversation with a friend actually over the weekend, and he has a close colleague that works in a very small, struggling firm, and they had an invoice that came in that was for £30,000. It was saying it was from the HMRC, demanding that a payment be made. £30,000 is a significant amount of money. The owner at the time put great pressure on a member of staff to pay it because the deadline date was fast approaching. The member of staff paid it, and then when they actually looked at the piece of paper, they recognised that the telephone number on that letter was wrong. It wasn't a HMRC telephone number. They phoned the bank, said, look, can we stop this payment? The bank was like, no, it's already gone through, and we can't give you your money back. So it's very easy to make a human mistake, but the consequences, both financially and emotionally, can be quite high. We are seeing, because we are now moving more into cloud-based solutions, there are greater attacks being made on cloud. Only this week, GoDaddy and WordPress were subject to a cyber attack. And most employers indicated that cyber awareness continues to be a top priority. Now, what I'm really interested to know from those of you that are online today is what's your reflection on those kind of statements? Is anything a shock to you? Did you think that the numbers would be higher? Are they too low? What's your reflections on these statements? It'd be really great to know. I can see some typing, so I'm just gonna wait a moment. Yeah, I agree. I don't think there's a lot of shock in these. And I think Microsoft are always going to be a very large target uh, for hackers, because a lot of organizations have moved on to Office 365. Um, I couldn't agree more. I think there's a real importance of training staff here. And it's not just your typical data protection training. I think we need to get a little bit more sophisticated when we're talking about training of our staff. We need to be considering cyber awareness. What is social engineering? And more importantly, what do you think are the biggest risks to your organization when it comes to breaches? And train your staff on that. Now, what I have seen a real increase in is this public awareness. And we've got another good point in the comments box here, is that IT teams are genuinely working flat out to try and prevent these breaches. And that they like to be able to try and keep on top of it, but they can't be the only ones that are responsible for it. And I think we do need to think about the emotional and financial impact of breaches. Now, what I have seen a lot of this year is I have had a lot of clients contact me and say, Kelly, we have had a letter sent to us demanding a very small amount of compensation in and around the £200 to £500 mark, because a cookie has been set on a person's device without their consent. Now, I have seen a lot of these messages, and in many ways, they are the individual was correct to raise the point that cookies were being placed on devices without consent, because the cookie consent either wasn't working or wasn't working properly. But it also put our clients into a real panic about, oh my God, I'm going to be taken to court. Is it easier to pay the money, or what should our response be? So what I would say to you is, be aware that individuals definitely know more about their rights than they've ever known before. Whilst I think the cookie complaints might start to drop a little bit, because last week, the Lloyd versus Google case, which was essentially Lloyd put in a case which was a representative action against Google, that said Google had placed cookies on devices without consent, and actually they felt that there was distress that had been caused, and the Supreme Court said, actually, you need to be able to demonstrate that those individuals have actually had their data breached. It's not enough just to talk about distress, which I therefore think that the cookie complaints might start to drop a little bit, which is great in my opinion, because they are incredibly emotional and draining for a lot of small companies to deal with. However, we are now seeing a lot more advocates, really, and activists channeling big tech companies to do better. So earlier this year, Apple released a new privacy approach, which says that when you download any new app now on an Apple phone, if you're using Apple, it will tell you how your data is going to be used by that software provider, and it asks all software vendors before they make an app go live on the App Store that you actually are transparent with where you're going to be using that individual's data, where you're going to be sharing it, and are you going to be monetizing their data for any purposes, which I think is a good thing. We have seen some very big tech companies fined. Whether or not the actual penalty will go all the way through. So WhatsApp was fined 225 million euros. They've currently been granted the action to challenge that amount of money by the Irish Commissioner. Amazon have been fined some crazy sum of money of 746 million euros because of them being they were not transparent in their privacy statements about how data is being used. Now, whilst you might think, well, Kellie, that's WhatsApp, that's Amazon, they're far too big. That's never going to be us. I would urge you to consider, when you think about your websites, when you think about the tools that you are creating and that you are pushing out to your customers, are you being transparent? Are you explaining to individuals how you're using their data? And are you giving them the ability to raise a concern and make changes to the way that you handle their data, like objecting to the use of cookies, for example? The other thing I would say, which I wanted to raise your awareness of, is that the ICO have actually issued a number of consultations. So there is the new employment practices guideline that closed at the end of last month. Now, the current code of conduct provides you with guidance about the entire employee life cycle. So it provides you with guidance about what data protection you should be considering when you're recruiting. So are you going to be using profiling as part of your recruitment processing? Are you going to be using employee monitoring now that you've got a workforce that is working remotely? And what to do when a member of staff leaves the organisation. Now, that guidance is quite fundamental, and when it gets published at the beginning, I imagine the beginning of 2022, it could have an impact on how you manage your employee data from a data protection perspective. So please keep an eye on it, and we will definitely do a webinar on that. Now, there is also a journalism code of conduct. At the moment, there is an exemption for journalists in terms of what they can use data for under data protection. And there is the AI and data protection risk toolkit. Now, because there is a significant increase in the use of AI, for any of you that are exploring AI or are already using it as part of your systems and solutions and analysis that involves personal data, I would really have a look at this consultation and have an opportunity to have your say if there's anything that alarms you. So have a look. But there's lots of codes that are coming out. Now, the other thing I would say, which came out, that's being presented at Parliament today, is this Product Security and Telecommunications Infrastructure Bill. Now, this is aimed at the consumer. So if you're in the business-to-business world, this is not something that's going to affect you, but it does affect you as a consumer on an everyday basis. So if you do offer products to consumers, so a piece of technology, an Internet of Thing, for example, you do need to be aware of this bill that is going through Parliament, and if passed, it will mean that easy to guess passwords preloaded onto any device will be banned, so you'll no longer be able to do that. As a customer, we must be told what the minimum period will be for updates to our technology and when patches will be applied. And security researchers who identify flaws, and they do it all the time, will be given an actual point of contact in an organization to say, I have identified a massive security flaw that you need to pick up. An example of that would be Sky. So Sky routers for 18 months had a security flaw in it, which was identified by a security expert, but only hit the public domain last week. So just one to consider, that we are getting different types of legislation that is being pushed out, and we need to consider, does this affect us? Does this affect my customer base? What do we need to put in to place? Many of you are not going to be affected by this particular bill from an organisation perspective, but you will be from a consumer perspective. And here are my early 2022 predictions. So some early food for thought, and I'd be really interested to what you think is going to come in 2022. But I have started to have some very interesting conversations with clients about wanting to do some monitoring of their employees whilst they are working remotely, because they're not confident that their staff are actually doing what they say they are doing. So employee monitoring could be, watching people through their web app, through the webcam, monitoring people's typing speeds, for example. H&M got fined for this this year, 35 million euros, because they didn't have a justifiable reason for doing it. So I think that because not only is our individual awareness going up, we might now take that into the workplace and say, I don't understand why my employer is doing this. Why are they monitoring me? I feel really uncomfortable about this. I feel that my privacy is being invaded. So there is the view that there will be a lot more employee backlash next year. Big tech, the likes of Apple, Facebook, Google, are all indicating that they are going to be giving us greater control over our privacy. Be interesting to see if it will happen. Obviously, Apple are already doing that. Governments are becoming a little bit more wary of big tech power and data hoarding. We're seeing that with some of the fines that are being issued by WhatsApp. Amazon is one of the biggest data brokers in the world, and as has been issued a massive fine. Facebook are potentially going to get a fine from the Information Commissioner in Ireland. And that's likely to continue because they have so much power in the data that they hold on us. Governments are really starting to get their teeth into how they can apply the data protection legislation to those companies to kind of bring them a little bit under control. The train or the horsemen have already bolted on that. For any of you that are using algorithms to create products and services that are informing decision making, that is using personal data, people as well as regulators, I believe, are going to start demanding more transparency. So what data are you using? Where have you pulled that information from? Is it in the public domain? If not, where have you obtained the data from? So really asking that, well, how did you get this information and how did you make this decision? So be prepared if you are looking at going down the AI, big data, algorithms route. You might be asked to have greater transparency if you don't already. And I think that this awareness of individuals and our right to privacy is only going to continue. Only this year did someone in Tame in Oxfordshire put in a complaint about their neighbour because of the use of a Ring doorbell, and they felt that their privacy had been invaded because the Ring camera captured data outside of the individual's border of their home, and therefore they were collecting information about the neighbour that made them feel really uncomfortable, and it really caused them a lot of emotional distress. But that neighbour won £100,000 in a financial penalty from the obviously their neighbour. So just be aware that not only are we as organisations getting more questions about how we use data from our customers, from our employees, in our own personal lives, we might now start being questioned about the use of Internet of Things, if people feel that there's a little bit too much invasion of data. Now, they're my predictions. What's everyone on the webinar? What do you think are your predictions for 2022? Do you think I'm way off, or do you think there's something I've missed that you think is the next big thing for 2022? I can see some typing, so. I do agree. I think Europe is going to become skeptical of our rules. I think there is going to be, I think the one thing I've not put on here, because I'm a little bit scared to put it on there, is if we pass a new data protection legislation next year, there could be massive ramifications for us as a country. In particular, Europe may no longer think that we're a safe pair of hands, which would put most of us in a real kind of not a nasty position, but a really kind of awkward position where we're going to have to do a lot more effort to be able to demonstrate our compliance to Europe. Thank you for the nice feedback about my prediction. That's a very good point as well. This conflict between governments and a lot of companies, and potentially individuals, will become the norm. I think so. I think companies are going to start trying to challenge the regulators and the government because of what the government's views are, where we should go because of what it fits their current agenda. So yeah, it'll be. I think 2020 is going to be a really interesting year for us. So I've been rattling on for 35 odd minutes. Does anyone have any questions about what I've covered so far, or any challenges they want to pose? More than happy to answer. If you're not comfortable asking any questions, you can obviously email me afterwards, or if you're listening to the recording, put it in a comments box and I'll come back to you on it. So interestingly, the individual the doorbell incident, I'm not quite sure how the fine was calculated. It wasn't, obviously they don't have a turnover or anything. I think what they based it on was the impact that the data collected had on the emotional distress and the mental health of the other neighbour, and that is the case that they put forward. They've not disclosed how they calculated the penalty, but it's a significant amount of money for an individual. I can only imagine that the chap is probably going to, if he doesn't have the cash, have to sell his home to be able to pay that financial penalty. But what has definitely been taken into consideration is the invasiveness of those cameras and the impact that it had. And the neighbour's argument was, the one that had the camera, was that I'm entitled to have a Ring doorbell for domestic purposes. And that is correct if the camera is only pointing within the borders of your property. The minute it goes outside of that and it captures the pavement, when I say borders, I mean the boundary lines. And the minute it goes outside of your boundary lines, data protection then comes into it, and you are then a data controller. And for me, I think it's the distress that was caused. Okay, so that's a really good question in terms of what would I suggest is the best thing for entrepreneurs to do in terms of cybersecurity for their business as a starting point. First, I'd really ask you to understand what is it that you're collecting from a data protection. So what is the data you're processing? Um, so you know the kind of the sensitivity of the data. I would then ask you to consider that if you've got a laptop and a mobile phone, what are you putting in place to protect those devices? So do you have two-factor authentication? Do you have backup? Do you have antivirus software on your system? Um, do you also have the ability to scan for any kind of faults? How often do you update your computer with the latest patches that come out from Microsoft or from um, Apple if you're on an iMac, for example? Um, and then I would consider looking at cyber insurance. I would do a very basic cyber course to understand how do I detect cyber incidences like phishing emails, but I would consider looking at the benefit of getting some cyber insurance just in case you are subject to an attack. You're kind of covered in that respect. So we are running out of time, but you can obviously ask me other questions. So a couple of things I just wanted to really briefly talk to you about is that we have our HR diploma and data protection course, which starts in January. It's 5 modules. Each of the modules are CPD accredited. It's in combination with Silo Beyond Your HR. So if you feel you want to understand employee data protection alongside everyday HR management, then this might be a course for you. We obviously can provide help in reviewing policies, delivering training. We do data protection lead as a service, and we can conduct audits if you're not sure about your level of compliance. We do have a very nifty catalogue, which you should have seen in the waiting room. If not, you can download it from our website. If any of you are interested in having a confidential conversation with other like-minded business owners or business individuals about data protection, we run a best practice group pretty much every other month. It's free to attend and you're welcome to join. Just send me an email. And then finally, feel free to follow us on all of our social media channels. We're there. We provide lots of freebie stuff. So if you're not interested in any of the paid for stuff, which is cool, we do a lot of free stuff. So that's me talking. If there are no questions, which you're more than welcome